All right. Hello, everyone. Just want to make sure. I think I am recording. Well, hello. This is not how I had hoped to do this last lecture, but here we are. I hope you're all staying safe. I hope you're doing okay in these pretty horrific circumstances here at Syracuse University. So today, I want to talk about the final sort of part of this unit, which is on solutions and politics, how we're going to solve this ecological and climate crisis we face. And today I wanted to focus on what seems to be the sort of big, explosive, exciting idea of how to solve climate change, which is the Green New Deal. And I want to kind of overview what the Green New Deal is and how it's different from traditional types of climate politics, and why there's a lot of historical precedent to be optimistic about this particular platform in terms of solving this issue. So I'm going to get right to it. The first part of this outline, as you can see, what is the Green New Deal? To put it briefly, the Green New Deal is really a kind of a vision of a massive public sector program, a public jobs program that would aim to build out infrastructure and green energy systems very rapidly in a way to sort of simultaneously solve climate change and inequality. So this is using the power of the government and the public sector to hire lots of people, to build lots of new infrastructure, and to basically achieve what the scientists in the intergovernmental panel on climate change say we need to do, which is to rapidly decarbonize our energy system in about a decade. So that's what the Green New Deal emerged. It emerged in response to this IPCC report that said we had 12 years to solve this problem. And it said, well, we need to listen to the science. We need to treat this as an emergency. And we need to embark on this very conscious, planned program to decarbonize our economy, at least partially, over the next 10 years and fully by 2050, which is where the science is saying we need to go. So, like I said before, this public sector-led public jobs program, it aims to kind of kill two birds with one stone, which is to solve climate change, but also to solve climate change through solving inequality, this sort of entrenched, rapacious inequality we have in our society. So the Green New Deal is it's a very vague construction, but it's actually become a resolution, a non-binding resolution that was proposed by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Ed Markey. And so this has been seen as the kind of framework of ideas about what the Green New Deal would be. And as you can see right there at the top, they're referencing this IPCC report in terms of the urgency of what we need to do. But they're also talking about that the United States not only faces this climate crisis, but it faces this crisis of inequality, wages stagnating since the 70s, horrible economic mobility, the 1% taking all the gains. So they're kind of looking at this as being a kind of set of twin crises we're facing, where life expectancy is declining and most working class Americans are really lacking access to basic needs. And they think we can solve this problem not only by building the green infrastructure and decarbonizing the economy, but also offering jobs and very material economic and benefits and improvements to people's lives. So you can see letter H there in the resolution. They have this pretty bold vision of guaranteeing a job with a family-sustaining wage, adequate family and medical leave, paid vacations. This is a very ambitious and bold vision of basically using this emergency to help improve the lives of a lot of unemployed and underemployed and precariously employed Americans to kind of build this new energy system very rapidly. Okay, so that's a general overview of the Green New Deal. I thought it'd be useful for this class to kind of situate this Green New Deal in terms of the strategies for green change that we've all, hopefully you all know and love by now, that were introduced to us by Andrew Dobson's article. You hopefully by now have written a paper on where you think the strategy should be for green change. But I actually see the Green New Deal as a combination of strategies that we have covered. The first is that the Green New Deal movement, which I'll talk about a little bit later, personified by the Sunrise Movement that we see here on the screen, the students with the, or not just students, but the young people with these Green Jobs for All signs. They are aiming, part of the strategy is to basically achieve this Green New Deal through the state, so through legislation, through the democratic state. And so they believe that to achieve the scale of transformation with this crisis we're facing, we can't really avoid the state. The state has incredible power and legal capacity to make this happen. So this is an article I showed you before when we talked about the state in this class, but Christian Parenti has been pretty influential, arguing that if we're going to solve the climate crisis, we need to think about the power of the state very strategically, and we need to think about how to push the state into embarking on these reforms. So he shows that the state can facilitate development. It can discipline capital, which a lot of people think we need to do. There are very specific fractions of capital whose business model depends on us not solving climate change. So the state is a legal entity that can force those fossil fuel companies, private investor-owned electric utilities to stop what they're doing. Okay. But he says, of course, this only happens if the state's elite personnel and politicians feel threatened. So this is where the movement comes in, right? We can't just sort of hope that our elected officials are going to do this on their own. We need to push them. So that's where the rest of the strategy comes. It's not just going to be the state on its own, but it's going to be a class strategy, which again, you read, this is sort of coming out of the long tradition of capitalist history of mass working class movements that have been able to unite through political parties, through trade unions, and through other sorts of institutions, through the state to push elites to pass beneficial reforms for the masses of people. So the class strategy, as you remember from Dobson, it really believes that to achieve class power, we really need to channel what we could call working class power. And if you remember from our lecture on capitalism, the working class is simply just the vast majority of people in a capitalist society who really cannot survive without selling their labor power for a wage or relying on other family members or dependents that do bring in money through wage labor of some kind. So channeling visions of why the working class is this most important strategic agent of change in a capitalist society, there are three things I want us to think about. The first basic thing is that the working class is the vast majority of society. So even if we kind of think about society being broken up into these middle classes, and I'll get into the professional class later, there's managerial occupations that are managing people in businesses. There are professional occupations like professors, nurses, and so forth. But the vast majority of people are working in low-wage, precarious types of jobs. They're working in production, factories, warehouses, construction, low-wage retail work, and other types of very low-wage, precarious service work. So if you look at this chart here that I'll be referring to throughout the lecture, you see that the working class is roughly by total 63% there in the bottom right, 63% of the employed population, roughly speaking, in the United States. So it's not, in this way of looking at things, it's not 99%, but it is the vast majority of society. And so the theory of the strategic, sorry about that, the theory of this strategic change is that if we want to win these bold, ambitious, massive reforms, we're going to have to channel the power of the majority of society. So the second thing about the working class is that they have a material interest in improving their lives, because the vast majority of these people in this bottom 63% are suffering very horribly in this highly unequal economy that the Green New Deal aims to solve. So you can look at economic research that shows that 40% of American households could not even afford a $400 emergency. You know, that's just simply if your car breaks down, if you have to go to the emergency room for any kind of thing. These are the types of things that can just completely wreck households that are living paycheck to paycheck, really struggling. So these masses of people struggling will obviously respond to programs that aim to improve their lives materially, which the Green New Deal does. We can look at other statistics. This is something I just pulled out. 80% of baby boomers are in debt. So basically, that's roughly the same for all generations. So now we're hearing a lot about, okay, boomer, and this kind of generational warfare. Well, actually, all generations have very precarious, oppressed classes within them. And so we have lots of people in the society who are just strapped and struggling with horrible levels of debt. So they have, again, a material interest in change. Okay, so, you know, another statistic I found is, you know, if you look at the median wage that people make in the United States, it's actually $31,000 a year, which means that 50% of wage earners make less than $31,000 a year, which is not a lot to live on. And so these are the types of conditions that are facing the vast majority of Americans. And so the Green New Deal believes we can channel that working class interest in material improvement to create this kind of popular program that they will respond to. So the third reason is that the working class also has kind of strategic power in the fact that their labor, their work, is what keeps society running. It's what's the basis of all businesses' profits. It's what the basis of more governmental public systems of what we call social reproduction. It's the workers that keep society going. I'm here at Syracuse University now, and there's so many workers that are cleaning the facilities, that are serving the students food, that are doing all this work, that if they were to stop, they have the power to kind of shut down an entire university and force the elites of that university to pay attention to their power. So just a bit over a year and a half ago, the teachers in West Virginia basically used their strategic power in the workplace to shut down the entire state's schools. And they had a set of demands, and they won those demands in the span of maybe 2 to 3 weeks. And that's the power of working class organization. If you can organize to shut down something like a school system, you can force elites in the state to respond to your demands. And just to reiterate, West Virginia is a red state, it's a Republican state, and these demands were very what we would call kind of left-wing demands for better wages for teachers, better health care, better conditions for schools, and they won those demands. Now, they could have just gone straight through the state to try to get the right people elected in this very Republican state. That would have taken them years and years and years, but by channeling this power of the working class, this strategic power they have in the workplace being the basis of profit and societal reproduction, they were able to win all this stuff very quickly. So this class strategy of the Green New Deal channels those three basic aspects. Again, the vast majority of society, the fact that they have a material interest in change, and that they have strategic power in the workplace. Now, the final thing the Green New Deal believes is that we need to use the direct action strategy to push against states. And actually, I just mentioned strikes, working class strikes. Those are kinds of direct action strategy as well. But if you see the picture up here with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Sunrise Movement, they are sitting in on Nancy Pelosi's office, who is a Democrat, and she was basically, this sit-in was trying to push her, the incoming Speaker of the House, Democratic House majority, to push those elites in the Democratic Party to say, we need action now for a Green New Deal. The scientists are saying we have 12 years to avert total breakdown of the planet's systems, and we need it now. And it's quite amazing. When they did this sit-in, it blew up, and it created such a heightened public conversation. And it skyrocketed the Green New Deal to kind of the top of policy folks' ideas of what we actually need to do. So the direct action tactic by the Sunrise Movement really did catalyze incredible amounts of change. And these folks, newly elected to Congress, what are often called the Squad, AOC in particular, were kind of at the forefront of channeling this direct action strategy to push for this Green Deal. So that's just a review of these strategies that should be well known to all of you at this point. Okay, so how is the Green New Deal responding to what might be called what I'm going to say is what's wrong with current approaches to climate politics? Now, the first part of what I want to talk about is that and we did a whole lecture on market-based policies to address climate change and ecological crisis. And those include things like cap and trade, which allow polluters to trade emission credits, but also things like a carbon tax, which puts a price on fuels and forces the emitters to pay this tax, pay this price. But all these market-based policies are basically based on this premise that we need to kind of internalize these costs of environmental pollution into the market mechanism. So what I want to talk about is actually this approach to climate policy has its own costs. And I call it the costly politics of these market-based policies because it actually basically exacerbates strategic problems with how we're actually going to win this kind of solutions to climate change. So the first thing to point out is that I have talked about that the ways in which our political economy shifted in the 1970s through a crisis, which was based on what economists call stagflation, was that there emerged to be a kind of political economic obsession with costs as being the big barrier facing most Americans. You see in the top right there, Ford's, let me move myself a little bit, and President Ford ran a campaign in 1976 based on this slogan, "Whip inflation now," because most polls showed that most Americans, their number one concern with the economy was rising cost, inflation, rising cost of bread, of fuel, of all sorts of things that people needed. And so what I have argued is that in the 70s, political and economic elites became quite obsessed with cost and the need to cut costs. And so, as you can see, when Reagan comes in 1981, one of the first things he wants to do is cut budgets, to cut the cost of government. But that wasn't just government, it was corporations. And you see in the bottom left there, you know, corporations are looking, how can they cut their costs in their supply chains and their global systems? How can they lay off workers, what is called downsizing? How can they make their systems more lean and mean and cost effective? But most importantly, it was households during this period. Over the last 40 years in this more unequal economy, wages are stagnant, people are in debt, and they're looking, how can we cut costs in our household and our budgets? So it's a kind of era of an obsession with cost. And so what I'd like to suggest is that market-based environmental policy that sees pollution as a kind of cost that needs to be internalized into the prices to get the prices right, as the climate wonk policy people like to say. It emerges out of this larger political environment that is obsessed with cost. And that it became this kind of policy consensus amongst kind of liberal professional policy thinkers, whether in government or academia. It became this consensus that the only way we're going to solve environmental problems is if we can make environmental problems visible to the market as costs, because again, we are in this environment where there's this kind of larger obsession with cost cutting, with belt tightening, with doing more with less. And so this was the idea. To make environment visible, we need to make it visible as a cost to the market and to consumers and to producers, and that's the way we're going to solve that. Now, here's the problem, what I would call the costly politics. It's played right into a kind of right-wing, this is David Koch of the Koch brothers and Americans for Prosperity, one of their kind of think tanks, which basically they were able to argue that these climate policies that want to impose taxes or caps or pollution reductions are all about costs for you and your family. And this is one of the leaders. He would hold these rallies about how this was during the Obama era, how Obama's climate legislation was basically going to raise the cost of everyday families' reproduction, raise their energy costs, raise their gasoline cost. And so this played right into kind of right-wing anti-climate politics, which basically says this is just some sort of liberal thing that's going to cost you and your family, and you should resist this. And so in many ways, the kind of consensus among liberal elites in government and academia played right into the anti-climate denying right-wing sort of attack on climate policy as being too costly, being too going to make United States businesses uncompetitive, et cetera, et cetera. And here you have Charles Koch in an interview in 2016 where he's actually saying that he's the one, this billionaire guy is saying that he's the one that is very concerned about poor Americans who consume a third of their, a huge percentage of their income on energy, and that these climate policies, all they're gonna do is raise the price of energy and hurt people, right? So this is the costly politics of market-based policy. It basically allows a much more populist kind of right wing to take advantage of these narratives and tell the American population that these policies are going to cost you. And this isn't just in the United States. I want to give a quick example of France, where Emmanuel Macron, a recently elected kind of centrist politician, he was trying to basically deal with France's obligations under the climate change agreement in Paris. And he said, we're going to set a carbon tax, and it's going to be levied on fuels for cars and diesel fuels and trucks and so forth. Now, this created a massive revolt that was called the Yellow Vest movement. And these were people that relied on, often people that relied for their work and for their everyday life on trucks and cars and things like this. And they are working in construction and so forth and so on. But they revolted to this carbon policy, to this tax policy. And they revolted from a very kind of working class perspective. You know, a lot of it was kind of problematic and things like that. But they had this working class anger at the very things that elites were saying could save the climate. And there's this incredible slogan that they started to congregate around, which you can see here in French and in the United States. But they were saying that elites are saying it's the end of the world when we can't even make it to the end of the month, which is, again, trying to say that, listen, we're here in the working class. We are struggling mightily just to survive. And we're having trouble thinking about why it's important to pay way more for fuel so that we can save the world in some abstract sense. So the slogan, if you don't read French, there is end of the world, end of the month, end of the world, same struggle. So they're trying to say that actually both these struggles over climate change and our daily struggles to survive are against the same people, which are the elites that run the state and elites that profit off the fossil fuel energy complex. But what the Yellow Vest movement showed was that these elite market-based policies, they make a lot of sense to elites, but they don't take into account the very material interest and needs of the masses of working class people in these societies, and they can actually backfire and lead to these kind of mass revolts. Okay, now the second problem with traditional climate policy is it is actually only speaking to a small base of the population that's in not the working class, what I would call the professional class. So let's go back to our graph here and see that in the middle class, this chart says that there is about 22% of the United States employed population could be considered professional class. Now, we can, there's a lot of debates on how to categorize the professional class. I like to think of it as people with educated degrees or advanced degrees, or maybe licenses. You know, you think about lawyers, professors, doctors, teachers, engineers, various types of people who are able to use education and credentials to gain entry into these sort of more elite labor markets, and then use their professional expertise to attain a kind of relatively secure middle-class existence. And one thing I want to point out is in this chart, he has this little thing below the professional class called proletarianizing, and he says there's about 11,000 of those 50 in the middle class that we could be saying as proletarianizing. Now, what does that mean? You're probably wondering. It means that they're actually, life for many professionals is getting so hard and worse that it's actually they are much more falling into the working class where they're struggling economically. I'm in academia. I have a lot of friends who have gotten their PhD, they've gotten the credential, they've done amazing research, and they're amazing teachers, and they're forced to work in this very precarious academic teaching system where they have to adjunct, and they get paid by the class. They make less than $20,000 a year. Sometimes they're on food stamps, and these are PhDs. Time magazine ran this incredible cover story a year ago in light of all these teacher strikes to show that a lot of teachers, some of the most valuable professions in our society, some of these teachers are like literally selling their blood plasma to survive. We are talking about people that can't afford to see a doctor, even though they're doing the most important work in our society by educating our children. And I think you would agree that I believe the children are the future. And this is pretty horrific that the teachers are living this kind of like what the chart would say, proletarianized working class life, where they're actually struggling so hard to survive. Okay. Now, but I would argue the professional class base of the climate movement thus far has been much more trying to appeal to the relatively materially comfortable parts of the professional class, people that work in salaried nonprofit workers, people that work in government and have a nice comfortable salary, people that are on the tenure track in academia and have tenured jobs and have a comfortable middle class existence. So for these they really respond to policies that are really smart and logical and kind of solve the problem in very technocratic terms. So one of the sort of amazing examples of this is something that was set up by this kind of right-leaning economist, a professional class person, who basically said we need to create this kind of coalition for carbon taxes, and they call them smart taxes, which professional class loves smartness. They want everything to be about being smart. And what this little Pagoo Club, Pagoo is actually an economist who came up with the idea of taxing things we don't like in society. You don't need to know this name, but it's actually a term in economics called Pagovian taxes. So the carbon tax is itself a Pagovian tax, and it's meant to tax the stuff we don't like, carbon emissions. And we see that this Pagoo Club had various people on the sort of left and the right. This is Al Gore, a left-leaning climate activist, but also this is Gary Becker, a right-wing economist from the Chicago School, who's seen as promoting free market neoliberal reform. Noam Chomsky is part of the Pagoo Club, well, probably the most radical left-leaning professor you could imagine. And even Lindsey Graham, a right-centrist Republican in Congress, is part of the Pagoo Club. So these are all professional class people. They're professors, they're politicians, they're elites. And this is the kind of policy that appeals to this base, smartness. Now, another organization that I think epitomizes this kind of professional class environmental politics is an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a bunch of people that want to pass a very specific legislation called a carbon fee and dividend, which is essentially a carbon tax. And they have this narrative that it is time to outsmart climate change. And again, by designing this very smart, wonky policy instrument, a fee and dividend that would actually charge a fee on carbon, recycle the dividends into households, is going to be able to solve climate change. Now, also the professional class that is living this kind of comfortable middle class lifestyle, they don't have the same kind of working class angst and insecurity, living paycheck to paycheck, trying to meet their basic needs, can't make it to the end of the month. No, professional classes are more anxious about their kind of affluence and their material security, which involves high levels of consumption. So they have what we've talked in this class about, this kind of green guilt, carbon guilt that racks them and makes them want to respond to a politics that's about less consumption, less stuff. And actually, that's why they also are quite responsive to something like a carbon tax, because ultimately that will make energy cost more, or it will make them and others consume less. So this is what the professional class really responds to, because they have all this anxiety about overconsumption of their own class position. So the goal here actually is that, again, the professional class is a very small percentage of the population. They are not going to be able to build the kind of coalition we need in a democracy, which is going to have to be the majority of society. So basically, an alternative to this is, what if we built a majoritarian climate politics that actually could be popular to the majority of society? So what if we actually try to design policies that were meant to be popular? And so essentially what all I'm saying in this scenario is the Green New Deal is basically trying to design policy as if democracy mattered, as if we want to actually mobilize and energize and excite the majority of people in the society. And again, that is not middle upper class professionals. So we need a new language, and the Green New Deal is trying to do that. So now I want to do a little bit of a history lesson. Now, if you did the reading for today, you were forced, you were forced to read a very short blog post that I wrote that talks about the lessons we can learn from the old New Deal. And I actually think there are a lot of lessons that help explain why this excitement around a Green New Deal is kind of channeling things from the past that we can learn from. So there are 4 key points I want you all to understand about the old New Deal. The first point is that it was actually not just Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s who did this by his own enlightened, smart, political savvy. During the New Deal period, there was massive working class revolt from below. So again, things like massive strikes. 1934 was the largest year of labor working class militancy in many, many years in the United States. You had strikes all across the country that were demanding basically power for working people in the form of unions and other kinds of benefits that might come from unionization, collective power, collective bargaining, and so forth. So the first lesson is that the New Deal was made by massive revolt from below. So that's what we need to think about how are we going to ignite that kind of protest and revolt from below? We're going to need to if we want to win something like a Green New Deal. Okay. The second key point is that the New Deal was based on an antagonistic politics against the rich and against the elites in society. FDR famously in a speech in 1936 that said basically all the rich people are unanimous in their hatred for me and I welcome their hatred. But he actually took action on this. He passed the Revenue Act of 1935, which, as you can see in this newspaper thing, was called the Soak the Rich Act. This was a revolutionary at the time type of intervention to make our tax structure way more progressive, to tax the rich at way higher levels, to actually fund this New Deal program. So you can see the protest. The rich can pay for the WPA. The WPA is the Works Progress Administration. And the New Deal was really based on this idea that actually the various wealthiest people who, by the way, actually caused the Great Depression, according to this politics, should be paying for this massive transition we need to employ millions of Americans and so forth. So actually, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has basically been saying the same thing. She was asked on 60 Minutes, how are we going to pay for this Green New Deal? And she says, well, actually, if you look at the last 40 years, we've been cutting taxes on the rich decade after decade, starting with Reagan and most recently Trump. Basically, the only thing that Trump has been able to accomplish is a massive tax cut for corporations and rich people. We can reverse those decades of tax cuts for the rich and create, again, like FDR did, a more progressive tax structure that can actually fund this ambitious public jobs program. So I have come up with a slogan that personifies this approach, which is that we should not tax molecules, we should tax the rich. And by molecules, I mean, hopefully you get it, you might not. I don't have this audience here to respond with laughter or silence, which is the more common response to my jokes. a silence. But this slogan that I just came up with, and I want to make bumper stickers, is the idea that a carbon tax is a tax on molecules. We don't really have a lot of anger towards carbon dioxide molecules. We don't have a lot of sense that it's carbon dioxide molecules that are hurting us. We do, maybe if we're educated enough, have a sense that we consume carbon-based fuels, and so that maybe a carbon tax will actually hurt us. So what the Green New Deal is calling for is, no, we're not going to do a carbon tax that taxes everyone. We're going to do a tax on the rich, the corporations, to fund this program. So it's not going to actually hurt the vast majority of people. Okay, let's see. I think I'm that's 2 points in. And the third point, the New Deal was incredibly popular. It was, FDR was and actually still is like one of the history's most popular politicians. This is his re-election campaign of 1936. As you can see, he just crushed this Republican Landon in the 1936 election. He only lost Maine and Vermont, which is kind of funny these days. We think of Vermont as a very left-leaning Bernie Sanders state, but not so much in this scenario. So FDR said he was going to fight for the masses of working people, and they responded. There are still an old working class bar in Syracuse here called Coleman's on Tip Hill. If you want to go, they still have a picture of FDR in that bar because he was a hero to the working class. He was, these programs, Social Security, minimum wage laws, labor rights, all these things were immensely popular. And so that gave a lot of power to the New Deal programs that actually masses of people loved it, wanted it, and thought it was great. And there's actually an amazing policy thinker behind the Green New Deal. Her name is Rhianna Gunn Wright, and she is part of a think tank called New Consensus, which has been a huge energy behind the Green New Deal. And she argued that she doesn't want everyone to really understand all the policy nuances of the Green New Deal. She just wants people to say that this is the thing that improved my community. This is the thing where they're building all this new energy infrastructure. It hired my uncle. It hired my cousin that was going through a tough time. That is the type of impact she sees with the Green New Deal, is that it will be built on these huge public sector jobs programs that are totally renovating and upgrading and benefiting the communities and populations, that everyone will just obviously see that this is a good thing. This is something we want. And that therefore it will create huge popular support, which again, carbon tax, no, it does not have huge popular support. In the last couple election cycles in the sort of left-leaning state of Washington in the Pacific Northwest, they've tried to pass a carbon tax through a referendum where voters were asked, do you want this carbon tax? 2016, 2018, it failed miserably in both cases. So the population is saying, no, we don't want taxes. The Yellow Vest movement is saying, no, we don't want this tax. So we need to learn from that. We need to make a climate program that's actually popular, that people think it's good. They think it's going to improve their lives. Number 4, actually, what we need to do to solve climate change is reform our energy system. And that's what the New Deal did. It massively created these programs that were about delivering energy, cheaper energy, to the people. And so that this is actually a slogan of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a government-run electric utility system that was set up in the Tennessee Valley in the New Deal period, had the slogan, electricity for all. Who can, and this was a period in which a lot of people didn't have electricity. So people could get on board with this. People could support this. And by the way, a lot of the AOC rhetoric that we hear today is about Medicare for all. It's about the Green New Deal is about green jobs for all. So this is actually channeling these kind of ideas from the New Deal period about something for all, okay? Also, the New Deal did things like, channel culture to really sell these programs. They hired Woody Guthrie, which we've talked about in this class, this legendary folk singer, to sing about the Columbia River, where they built these New Deal era dams, which we've learned recently have had bad ecological effects. But they built these dams to provision cheap, massive amounts of electricity to rural people. And as you can see here, if we move we don't need to move me, you can read it. Roll along Columbia, you can ramble to the sea, but river, while you're rambling, you can do some work for me. So this very popular vision of like the river doing work for the masses of people, it must, I would imagine, have really inspired people to be like, this New Deal. It's, again, this is why it's popular, because it's building things for the people. Now we can try to imagine Bob Dylan today singing a folk song about the carbon tax, and we can imagine how popular that would be. Okay, now I don't want to be all rosy and sunshiny and rainbows and lollipops, because the New Deal also had some problems. And actually, I believe Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Sunrise Movement, New Consensus are taking these problems seriously to try to think through how can we learn lessons from the negative parts of the New Deal. So the first negative part is that the New Deal had a lot of exclusions for particularly people of color in its kind of policy framework. So for instance, there were incredible gains for the labor movement, but the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which gave collective bargaining rights to workers, it gave workers the rights to organize, to form unions, it actually had two key exclusions of the workers that weren't part of this law and therefore were excluded from those rights. And those were domestic workers, people that worked in folks' homes, and those were farm workers. Okay, so that was African Americans in the South, but also a lot of migrant, Latino and Asian and other largely migrant workers of color in the farm sector in California and throughout the United States. So these exclusions were actually quite devastating to a lot of working class African American and migrant farm worker communities. Should have mentioned the huge majority of domestic workers were people of color still today and at this time as well. So this is a big problem, and we need to be honest about the New Deal. It was actually crafted with a pretty nasty coalition. You may notice in that map that I put up there, FDR won the entire United States besides Maine and Vermont, but he also won the South. And that's because during the 30s, the Democratic Party actually had part of its coalition was in the South. They were called the Dixiecrats, the Democratic Party, and they were basically the elite of the South, the former plantation owners and current plantation owners who had benefited from the slavery plantation system. And they were believed in segregation. They were incredibly racist. And FDR, you know, he was not particularly racist himself, but he was sort of realistic politically, and he had to kind of try to forge this coalition that relied on these racist Southern Democrats. But like I said, the Green New Deal, and I'm going to point you to this video at the end that you should watch, is really trying to actually center marginalized communities of color as central to the coalition they're trying to build. So that's one way they're trying to learn these lessons. And the other lesson to learn is that the New Deal actually used public power to build a very privatized type of geography of suburbia. So the New Deal is what set up these housing programs that allowed white people like these folks to move to the suburbs. And the New Deal built highways and built bridges to connect suburban areas to cities. And so the New Deal was much kind of like a almost socialistic public works project to actually build a highly privatized suburban geography that we saw in the post-World War II era that actually catalyzed what we've talked about in this class, the Great Acceleration. So this mass consumption suburban geography was actually created by the New Deal. And so ironically, we used all this public support and public energy to create public works programs to produce a very privatized geography. And then decades after that, that suburban privatized geography actually became the popular basis of what we've talked about as neoliberal politics, the kind of anti-government, anti-public, anti-taxes that came from suburban areas that actually had relied on public support to build the suburban geography in the New Deal. But if we're going to have a Green New Deal, we cannot build a renewed privatized type of society. We need to build public housing. We need to build public transportation. We need to build public systems, not only because it will help channel a more public-oriented politics, but also because to solve climate change, those systems are going to be way more efficient. They're going to use less energy. They're going to be much more green. So public housing, public transit are like the greenest things we can do. Okay, so those are the two negative lessons. Basically, they excluded workers of color and that they use public resources to build privatized geography, privatized politics. Okay, so I'm trying to keep track of time here. I think I'm at about 42 minutes, which is actually pretty good. I'm very sad to not have all my amazing people in the front couple rows kind of peppering me with questions. So I'm going a little quicker than I expected. But that's great because I actually wanted to end with like 7 minutes to spare so you can all use your 55 minutes. Part of it, I want you to watch this video. So let me end now. Well, not end. Part 5 is actually how we can recover this deleted history. And that's what that think tank I mentioned, New Consensus, one of their thinkers mentioned. Like, we forget in the United States that we are the richest country in the world, but also that historically we've had the capacity to do amazing, radical, transformative things very quickly. So the question is, we can do this. We can do this kind of Green New Deal. We just need to look back in history to see that there is precedent. So again, I mentioned the New Deal about bringing energy to the people. There was something called the Rural Electrification Administration that you can see on the left there. It was actually trying to build out electricity to rural areas because private electric utilities didn't think it was profitable to service those rural areas. So they just said, we're just going to let them not have electricity. The New Deal said, no, we're going to deliver electricity to the rural masses. And they did so through this program. And it was amazing. In 1934, about 10% of American farms had electricity. By 1950, that was 90%. So that is the kind of scale of transformation we're talking about with the Green New Deal. That's what we need in like 15 years. We need to go from 10% renewables to 90%, right? That has been done. Not that, but massive transformation, electrifying the countryside from 10 to 90% had been done. The last example that people like to call upon is World War II. Now, we hope we can achieve decarbonization without massive military conflict. But we can look to World War II as a moment of emergency, like the climate crisis is, and a moment in which the government channeled all its energy, all its resources, all its focus on defeating the Nazis and defeating the Japanese. And the government essentially took over the entire economy in the World War II years, which this book details. And they stopped saying, you know, they didn't just let the market figure it out. They said, no, we need this many planes, we need this many tanks, we need this many X, Y, Z. And so this government takeover of the economy, this World War II scale mobilization, it actually transformed our industrial base in the span of 3 or 4 years. And that's what they did. They built new factories, they built new systems. And so that's actually what we need now too, is a massive government sponsored, but also grassroots type of restructuring of all our energy infrastructure. And the World War II example shows that in an emergency, we can do this. We can actually channel the power of movements and social and the government itself to achieve massive changes to our industrial base very quickly. So people talk about we need to resurrect this idea of what people call industrial policy, which sounds kind of wonky and kind of boring, but that's what we actually need is industrial policy. We need to actually guide what our industrial systems are doing. We need to guide them towards a goal, not of profit, but of decarbonization. Okay, so we can do this. The IPCC says we have 12 years. Well, if you look at that period between 1933 and 1945, in those 12 years, we did unbelievably transformative, crazy things in this country. And we need to recover that deleted history to know what we're capable of. We're still the richest country on the planet. We still have all these resources. Okay, now I'm gonna end by saying that the basic part of the Green New Deal is it has this incredible positive vision of the future. Again, it's not about cutting and sacrifice and cutting your lifestyle or cutting costs. It's about a beautiful vision of the future. And that, again, is what we need to kind of build this mass popular support for this program. And so what I want you to do once you close this file is I want you to go, and I'll put a link up to the YouTube video that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others made about imagining what society would look like if a Green New Deal is actually won. And it's an incredibly positive and beautiful vision. And they actually based this video on the article you read by Kate Aronoff. That's down there at the bottom. That's where they got the idea. So again, this is a new kind of climate politics. It's not about doom and gloom. It's about, hey, we can do this. We can create a program that is going to actually improve most people's lives and solve the climate crisis while we do it. So that is where I want to end, and I'm so sad I can't end it with you all in person, because this is supposed to be the kind of last galvanizing lecture of the class that tries to make a case that we don't need to be so despairing, that there's actually now a political movement that has a plan, has a vision, and has a I think a realizable strategy of how to build this movement to solve this crisis. So I hope you enjoyed this video and lecture and you feel a little bit inspired. And on that note, I'm going to say goodbye, and I will see you all after the break. If you're still watching, remember we have a review session on Monday after break for the exam. So that's going to be it for me. Have a great break and stay safe in all this craziness on our campus. Okay, bye.